Good morning. It's Bernard Nomberg with another episode of NOMBERG Law Live. We come to you every Tuesday at 10 o'clock. Due to the inclement weather that I think we're going to be having when you're watching this, Sam Tenenbaum, my friend, the Great Kaiser, has decided we've come in today and we're going to tape an interview. And we appreciate your few minutes and hope that all is well in your world and that you are home safe and warm. Good morning, Sam.
Good morning, Bernard. Good to see you, buddy.
I appreciate you coming in for a few minutes and us talking.
My pleasure.
For those of you who don't know Sam, and there's probably only a few of you who don't, Sam is a longtime Birmingham resident. He is a multifaceted, just awesome fella I've had the privilege to get to know over the last few years. So we're going to jump in for a minute. And Sam, if you would, just tell the folks a little bit about yourself.
Well, I have kind of a mapped out history. It started very early in my life. My grandmother on my mother's side was from Coral Gables, Florida, Miami. And I happened to spend a lot of time down there, although I was here in Birmingham. My father was from here. And she instilled something in me that was rooted early in my life. She had a love of opera, of all things. And she made me listen to, some of you won't even remember this singer by the name of Enrico Caruso, the great Caruso. Mm-hmm. And I listened to his records as a kid from infancy until I was indoctrinated and enamored with his voice. And so I got an early appreciation of opera, which was one of my passions in life, which we can talk about a little later. And that started the whole deal off, and me acquiring later in life, really early childhood, a singing voice, which I still have. And I became an operatic tenor myself. I studied and went to school and did it as an elective. And so that was one of the ways I got started in one of my passions. Of course, the other passion, not to get too far ahead on you, came later in life. I was a weightlifter and a wrestler in high school, and at the gym. I spent a lot of time early years at the JCC on Montclair Road, and also the downtown YMCA, the old Y.
Well, let's go there.
All right.
Sam, you grew up where?
Well, I grew up here in the south side of Birmingham originally, and my father built a home. He was a real estate lawyer, and I can brag a little bit of prominent lawyer.
Certainly.
And he built a home over in Mountain Brook sometime around when I was 13 years of age. So a lot of my childhood was just right here on the south side to start off with, on Highland Avenue, and then we went to Mountain Brook and off of Old Leach Road, the same house that I'm still in, which I'm enjoying very much.
Still in today?
Yes, sir.
Now, Sam, the people who know you in the Birmingham metro area, and particularly at the J and see you around town, and if they grew up in the 70s and 80s, they know you for two things. One, they know you to be able to sing opera, which you've done publicly beautifully many times, but they also know you for your wrestling. What was your wrestling nickname, and how did that come about?
Well, that was my second passion in life, and that started at a relatively early age too. Around 17 years of age, by the way, it was a Great Kaiser, which I wrestled for maybe 35 years throughout the southeastern United States in Birmingham at Boutwell Auditorium, and did it for years here under a mask, which that's the way they wanted it. And it seemed to keep me surviving under that mystique for a long time. So the way that I got into it was a little unique and unusual. At 17 years of age, I was a rather tall, skinny, undeveloped guy. I wasn't very athletic, but I started lifting weights, and I ended up going to Marion Military Academy in Marion, Alabama, a very tough but fine military school. And in that period of history, I had a pretty rough 9 months of learning how to take care of myself and defend myself. I was on the boxing team down there, the wrestling team, and I started lifting weights. And I got to a point where I could see some real gains in strength, size, weight, muscle. So 1 year was about enough of that, but I came back to Birmingham, and at that period of history, I couldn't get back into the Mountain Brook system, so I ended up going to Phillips High School, which was, by the way, a very fine school my senior year. And I got on the wrestling team and did very well. lettered in wrestling. I was about 238 pounds at that time, about 40 pounds heavier than when I went to Marion. And so that's how I got interested in wrestling, just getting the basic amateur fundamentals. Plus at the JCC I did some wrestling, intercollegiate style. And also we had a judo instructor whom I worked with, and I developed a black belt in judo, the sport judo, which we did it in conjunction, which helped me so much in wrestling from many facets.
Well, Sam, if you haven't read Sam's memoir, The Unmasked Tenor, I highly recommend it. It is a fantastic read. Sam, I read in here about that year that you spent at Marion. That was a growth year, wasn't it?
It certainly was. It was actually the turning point of my whole life and career at a very early age. It established and locked in the things in life.
Sam, tell us about, after you had that 1 year at Marion Military, you came back a changed guy.
Absolutely.
From what I read in your memoir, it was a tough year for you, but it was a growth year.
Absolutely.
What did you take away from that year?
Well, it probably was the best thing that ever happened to me. Inadvertently, I had no idea I was going to survive that year, because I was just a city boy and kind of from a good family, as I just stated, and there were a lot of rough guys down there. And in the book, you'll read about some of the fisticuffs I encountered.
How much weight and muscle did you gain
Well,
during
actually,
that year?
I'll give you a good example. I was about 170 pounds, and I was tall, but I was very thin, and came back over 200 pounds, maybe 210
Wow.
or 15.
Wow.
And the interesting thing, I don't mind mentioning this, very dear friend of mine in Birmingham, many people know him. He hadn't seen me since years before, Jimmy Filler.
Sure.
And I ran into Jimmy, who's a great guy. We all know how wonderful he is, generous fellow. And he saw me at a restaurant, and he looked at me and he says, "Sam, is that you?" He says, "I don't even recognize you. What happened to you?" I said, "Well, I just got bigger and stronger and gained some weight and muscle, and that was my goal." And so that really was the changeover from my young childhood, only a music lover predominantly, and singing in the choir. And
You were a whole different guy, but when you came back,
like a complete change of personality. And it somehow or another, I migrated into that personality, and it fit me well.
Well, let's talk about, Sam, let's transition into your wrestling career.
Sure.
Wrestling in the South is, well, in the United States is nothing like it is today.
Exactly.
If I remember correctly, it was all regionalized, and certain promoters had certain territories.
Exactly.
And you being a Birmingham guy, I know that you had some issues. Maybe I want you to talk to us a little bit about that. I know that you describe a little bit about how the territories were divided up, and take us into your first few years of professional wrestling.
Well, as a break-in wrestler, I started off the hard way. I learned from a professional wrestler who is still alive, by the way. He's in the book. His name was Joe Honeycutt. He was just a good friend, and still is. He's 94 years old and still kicking. He's a tough old guy. And I just ended up training with him. He met me at the downtown Y, the old YMCA, which is now Regions Bank on 20th Street.
That's right.
And it's moved, of course.
Yeah.
And so I nagged him to death. I said I was interested, and he said, "Well, we'll see what you can do." So I trained for about 9 months with him at his home out on Rocky Ridge Road, and he helped me get started, and he was tough. He was an old-fashioned guy. We threw the medicine ball. We lifted weights. We ran track. We'd gotten a ring that he had set up in the back of his yard and learned basic moves and holds and how to fall, which is so important. But basically, wrestling in Birmingham was very regional, but we had an opportunity through the promoter, Nick Goulas, to go to other places, such as Memphis, Nashville, Chattanooga was his territory, and Mississippi, Starkville, I was there, as in the book I mentioned the situation. And I got a chance to spread my wings, and so I ended up, and also I had a connection in Florida with a very prominent wrestler at that time and promoter of the old regime, Eddie Graham, who got me into the Florida territory. And I love Florida because my roots go there anyway.
Sure.
And
Sure.
so I went back and forth to Florida. And then I had an opportunity to go to North Carolina and spend 9 months working out of Charlotte, North Carolina. And that was a real good experience. It was some of the top pros of that era.
So you really got to travel all over the Southeast.
I sure did, and I
Hold on
enjoyed
a
it.
second. Okay. All right, go ahead.
And
Let me reset the question real quick. Sam, you got to travel all over the Southeast. You wrestled in several states, but early in your career, what was the name that you went by?
All right, that's a good question.
Because I want you to lead up to how you got the Great Kaiser.
Yeah, well, actually, I started off in a little small town here locally, Aniana, Alabama. And you wouldn't think they had wrestling there, but they did. And it was in a theater called the Neely Theater. And the gentleman that put it on was almost like the mayor of Aniana and also a very prominent wrestler in the state of Alabama, Nick Carter. And very few would remember Nick except the old timers like me. And he gave me a chance to be on the card, but I didn't use the Great Kaiser. I had an alias name, and it was kind of a shockaroo. And I think you know what it was. And he wanted to draw some of my Jewish friends, so he billed me as the Jewish Angel. And so I got to Aniana, and there was a big sign in the Neely Theater. I wasn't the only wrestler, but it was packed full of maybe 400 or 500 for that theater. They had the ring set up on the stage, and here I was, the Jewish Angel, which I didn't particularly want that name,
Right.
but I had to live with it that night. And so that was my introduction into wrestling, and it was an interesting night. Needless to say, I had some comments, some positive, some negative.
What year about was this?
This was probably 1968. That's a long time ago.
And society's norms and society's acceptances are a little different 50 years ago than they were today. So how long did you wrestle under that name?
That was it.
Just that night?
Yeah, and Nick Carter was a great guy. He just wanted to draw a good crowd from this area, and we did have a good crowd. He put billboards all over the areas, and we drew very well. And also my friend Joe Honeycutt was there, that I told you about.
And he also wrestled under what name?
Well, Steele Dawson. He was an old timer.
Sure.
Some of the real old timers will remember him. And also there was another famous wrestler on that card, Tarzan White, who played football and was an All-American. And many people remember Tarzan White. He was an unusual guy because he was an All-American football player for Alabama, and they also inducted him into the Alabama Sports Hall of Fame. So I was with good company. And by the way, he was a tough old guy. And all you football fans, if you think wrestling is just easy, ask Tarzan White or get in the ring with him one night in his prime, and you'll find out how rough it was. He didn't pull any punches. He threw haymakers.
Sam, tell us about how eventually you came under wrestling under the name of the Great Kaiser.
Well, that was an interesting transition. I went to Atlanta on WTBS when it first went on the air, and that was probably somewhere, I'm guessing, in 1973. The Superstation, they had wrestling, was very popular, and it went all over the country. So I got an opportunity after wrestling around here in smaller venues to hit the TV on Saturday where they filmed it, and it was nationwide. So there was a very famous wrestler, I think he's still alive, a great wrestler of that era called Ole Anderson, and they called him the Minnesota Wrecking Crew. And he said, I want you to come over here, you're a big guy, and I'm going to bill you as the Great Kaiser. He gave me some of that idea. And also, I had a very good friend in Birmingham, I have to mention him, who later on ended up managing me some and helping me with my career. And he was interested in wrestling and weightlifting. His name was Johnny Peoples III. And Johnny was a real interesting character. He worked on the set of Stay Hungry, the movie. I mentioned him in the book.
I'm going to find his picture while you're telling the story.
Sure. Johnny was a character, but he was a good guy, and he helped me get started promoting me in Birmingham as the Great Kaiser. And he picked up on that. Absolutely. Johnny was a very good weightlifter at his time, and ironically ended up a good friend for many years. Unfortunately, I lost him a few years ago, but during his part-time career managing me, he also was a weightlifting coach at the JCC on Montclair Road. And he did a good job, and many people studied under him and benefited from him. He was eccentric, and he was a character, but we made a good team.
Tell us about the time that you had an encounter with Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah, that was interesting. The movie Stay Hungry, which was made here originally, Arnold's first speaking role, was produced in collaboration with a novel by Charles Gaines, who was a Birmingham author and writer. He wrote the screenplay and ended up selling it to, it was a good seller of the book. It was all about bodybuilding, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was just over here and had just established a name as a very prominent bodybuilder and had won some big contests. So it was a life story about an Austrian immigrant and how he came over here with no money at all. I think he had $50 to his name, and ended up becoming a very successful bodybuilder. So they filmed the movie here in Birmingham because Schwarzenegger, Charles Gaines lived here, and they did a lot of the scenes. So I was hanging around the set, and also my friend Johnny Peoples worked around the set. And we filmed a couple of extra parts. The main part that I was involved in, well, before I got to meet Arnold, it was a crowd scene, of course, filmed right at the last, and there was a bunch of bodybuilders running around and standing around in the crowd scene. And most of the bodybuilders who had lead roles were in from California, Arnold's buddies. But I met Arnold at an old motel on the set during the summer when they filmed it, and he was sitting around the pool, and I was just invited over there and sat around the pool and got to know him, and we both were kind of pumped up from working out. I worked out with him at the old downtown Y, which at that period of history is one of the few places that you could work out. And so he and I got to be kind of friendly, and we had worked out some together, and I sat around by the pool with a whole bunch of pretty girls and looking at all of our so-called muscles that we had. And we had a good time. And Arnold was a character. And also, I had just started with that name, the Great Kaiser, but Arnold said to me, he says, "That's a good name for you." He says, because in the book, actually, I hadn't told him, but he said, you know, a big guy like you, before I informed him, he says, you should do like me and say you're from Austria and put a mask on and say you're the Great Kaiser. That's a good name for you. He gave me that idea, and actually Johnny had already given me that idea behind the scenes. And so Johnny was out there visiting also at the pool, and I'd already started that with Ole Anderson in Atlanta, but Arnold says, that's a good name for you. And I told him, well, I'm trying it out. And he says, that'll give you a lot more recognition than just wrestling as an alias without it gives you a mystique with a mask.
Sure, sure.
So that's some of the credit I'll give Arnold, and I enjoyed the collaboration, and also the movie was fun, and they experienced a lot of people here in Birmingham that I made some friendships with.
I bet that was a fun experience.
It was.
For those of you just joining in, thank you for spending some time with us. I'm talking with Sam Tenenbaum, the Great Kaiser. Sam has got some wonderful stories that he's sharing with us, and we're going through some of those right now. The next thing I want to transition to is getting to wrestle at Boutwell Auditorium on Monday nights. I know that was a big time. It was a goal, it seemed like, for you, and you were able to do that. But take us back to the 70s and 80s,
Yeah.
when you were able to get to Boutwell.
Yeah, that was an experience because wrestling had a place, a home here, and thank God Boutwell Auditorium is still here. It's one of the few things they didn't tear down. They use it for a lot of good things now.
They do, including warming stations.
Absolutely,
Nights
which
like
is very
tonight.
important. We're going to need it. So wrestling every Monday night was at Boutwell Auditorium, and Nick Goulis, the promoter, did a great job bringing in all the Southern wrestlers, and so I kept on plugging away. And then after Nick retired, I was still going strong. There was two promoters, the nephews, the Fuller brothers, and actually their real name was Welch. Nick's partner was Roy Welch out of Nashville, and they ended up taking over, and they were the wrestlers too. And also, they gave me an opportunity to do one of the biggest wrestling events they ever had at Boutwell. I wrestled the sportscaster Herb Winches, who was at that time predominantly on Fox 6, and he was the lead sportscaster, very colorful guy, as we know.
Would it be fair to say that Herb Winches was kind of the Paul Feinbaum before Paul Feinbaum, at least locally?
I would think that would be more than fair. Actually, Herb was one of these guys that could do everything. He was an athlete. He played football for Jacksonville State. Then he became a sports announcer, and he liked to try different activities. He did a little bit of everything. He was kind of like the old George Plimpton, who was a sports.
Very good analogy.
Yeah, and Herb approached me one day. He says, "If you ever," it was during May, and they were looking for the ratings. And he says it was off, football season was over, and he says, "Would you like to talk about maybe doing a wrestling deal with me to help Fox 6 with the ratings?" I said, "Well, yeah, we can try it." So he decided to come to the studio and have me and my manager, Johnny, who was around the ring and helped a lot with the code. And we talked it up. And originally I'd been interviewed by Herb at Boutwell, and he got into a confrontation with me the week before, and I picked him up by the collar and kind of shook him, and that started the whole thing. He didn't like that, at least he acted like he did.
And how many weeks did this play out on TV?
It was actually about 2 weeks of promotion. And so then we were supposed to go up and apologize to him, and I simply told him, I says, "The only way you're going to get an apology from me is to climb in the ring with me next week." So he said, "Well, let me think about it." And so he took about another week, and he says, "I think I'll take the Kaiser up on that pledge, and I'll find out." So he started training a little bit with a local wrestler by the name of Mike Jackson, who's very popular in the area, and who's a very fine guy, trained a lot of wrestlers and still does. So the big night, everybody in town knew about it. People that ordinarily never would come to a wrestling match wanted to see this. And, they wanted to see if Herb was going to survive. And around the ring, they had the Birmingham Stallions.
That's right.
Who was the only football team that ever really made it good here. And and their manager was Raleigh Dortch, and he was very, very good at cooperating. And they had the Stallion football team around the ring. In case one of us got thrown out, they were going to help us get back in. So Herb was all keyed up and ready to go, and I was ready to go. And I think we had the biggest crowd on record at Boutwell Auditorium they've ever had.
Wow.
And it was 6,100 with seats in the aisle, and upstairs it was packed. It was actually a fire trap, but they got away with it. And interestingly enough, people that never would come to a wrestling match, lawyers, doctors, professional people, were curious. They wanted to see it.
Well, that's what I was going to say, Sam. Back at that time period in the mid-'80s, unlike today where on the internet you can watch anything, anytime, all the time, wrestling really had a very important part in television, particularly regionally.
Absolutely.
And it was the place to get your entertainment from a sports standpoint if you weren't watching baseball, basketball, the traditional sports.
Yes, very good point. Well, in those days they didn't have the variety of sports like they do now. So, and especially in Birmingham as well as other southern cities, the promotion had established a very popular group of wrestlers that were so popular in those days that people looked at them like household names. Give you a few examples. There was a Japanese wrestler, Tojo Yamamoto, and the fans were crazy about him. They hated him, but they loved to watch him. And then there was an Italian wrestler who's still alive, by the way, Len Rossi, who lives in Tennessee area. Len was an outstanding performer in the ring. And go ahead.
I was going to say, that's what I loved about each of the wrestlers. All had their own backstory. So you could get behind your guy if you affiliated or if you liked something about that particular wrestler. You tell them, give folks a little brief backstory about what you had for the Great Kaiser.
Well, my predominantly Birmingham crowd that knew me, which I grew up in, well, a lot of them really didn't know I was the Great Kaiser, but I had an Austrian accent. I was from Austria, the Great Kaiser, and I was a big guy, and so many people started trying to figure out who was the Kaiser and what did he do and where did he really come from. Of course, I said I was from Austria, so sooner or later they started discovering who I was. I did a lot of public appearances. I even did some singing under the mask as the Great Kaiser, and I still do, mostly without it now, but I would perform the national anthem, and they said, that guy can sing pretty good for a wrestler, so they got to see another side of me, and that gave me a second personality other than my wrestling personality, which was rather rough and brash in the ring.
Well, there was no internet to research people back then, so you kind of put out your own facts.
You had to.
But I want to transition to what you're getting into, Sam. Do you have a greater love, wrestling or singing, or is it hard to say?
Well, that's a very good question, and I have to give you as honest answer as I can. My first love was always a professional singer. I still do have an accompanist and still practice, and I sing on occasion when I can, and I do certain events when I'm asked to participate. But as an operatic tenor, which is my style, and having performed some operas, I was in 2 actual operas in college at the old Temple Theater. Very few would remember that. That was really before I got into wrestling. I was still in college at the University of Montevallo. By the way, I did a Barbara Seville and another opera, Susanna, by Carl L. Floyd. And although I didn't have the lead parts, I did have a few little small solo parts and got experience. But after singing all those years and still having that to fall back on now, it would be pretty hard for me to say that singing wasn't my first love and my first priority. And it still is, and I'm just very fortunate that I can still do it. You know, it's almost like going to the gym, which I see you all the time at the JCC. Singing is more athletic than intellectual. You have to have certain technical things that you need. But if you have the voice, and if you don't work it like you train physically to stay in condition, singing voice is the same thing. If you don't use it, you lose it. So it gave me an incentive also, and still does, to have something to look forward to. You know, my wrestling days are over with. Thank God I'm still around.
Well, I've had the privilege, Sam, of hearing you sing the anthem at the beginning of the Montclair run on Thanksgiving Day. I've heard you a couple of times in the past at the Temple. And if you haven't heard Sam sing, you really should make a point to do so. It really is a privilege to hear you sing. Sam, I can't thank you enough for this time this morning, taking us down memory lane and sharing a little bit about Sam Tenenbaum and the Great Kaiser. If you haven't read a copy of Sam's memoir, you got to pick it up.
You can get it everywhere.
This particular copy happens to come from the library. I think they have them for sale, maybe at the J. You can always
bookstores.
Well, I was going to say local bookstores. You can find Sam.
Amazon.
You can find me. Amazon. If you have questions for Sam, or if you want to make comments about your run-ins, good or bad, with Sam over the years, put them in the comments section. We'll make sure that Sam gets those, and hopefully he can respond. Again, Sam, I sure appreciate your time today.
It's a pleasure. You do a great job, by the way.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun, real treat for me.
Sure was.
Guys, we come to you every Tuesday. We try to come to you with our interviews live, but sometimes the weather just doesn't permit. But I was glad Sam was able to come in today. Please check back with us every Tuesday, 10 a.m. Central, 8 a.m. Pacific. We hope you guys have a safe, warm, and great rest of your week. Take care.